The blizzard came out of the north like God's own fury, turning the Dakota sky white and swallowing the world whole. Mabel Hirsch hunched over the reins of the stolen wagon, her knuckles bloodless beneath wool gloves, stiff with ice, her breath freezing in crystalline clouds against the scarf wrapped around her face. The leather reins bit into her palms, even through the fabric, and her shoulders burned from the effort of holding the panicked horses steady against the wind that shrieked like a living thing tearing at her cloak and searching for exposed skin with fingers of killing cold. Behind her, in the wagon bed, wrapped in every blanket she'd been able to grab during those frantic minutes of escape quilts from her own bedwool army blankets from Leopold's supply room. Even the fine damask coverlet from the guest room that had never seen a guest, her sons huddled together in a nest of fabric and fear. Edwin, 9 years old and already bearing the weight of being the eldest and the protector, the one who understood too much, held his brother Oliver close against his chest. Oliver just 6, and burning with fever that flushed his cheeks scarlet against the deathly white of the storm, shivered despite the blankets, despite Edwin's body heat, despite everything. "Mama." Edwin's voice barely carried over the wind, thin and frightened, in a way that tore at Mabel's heart. Her serious boy, her little man who tried so hard to be brave. "Mama, I can't see anything. Where are we going?" "Keep your head down," Mabel shouted back, though her own eyes stung with snow and tears that froze on her lashes, turning her vision into a kaleidoscope of ice crystals and white emptiness. "Cover your brother's face. Don't let him breathe the cold air directly." The horses Leopold's best team stolen along with the wagon and everything else she'd taken struggled through drifts that reached their chests, their powerful bodies laboring against snow that seemed to have weight and malice. Their breath came in great plumes of steam that the wind tore away instantly. Mabel could feel their exhaustion through the reins, the trembling in their muscles, the way their gait had become uneven and uncertain. How much longer could they go on? How much longer before they simply stopped? Gave up? Let the storm take them? How much longer before she had to make that same choice? The saddlebag at her feet, pressed against her boots, held secure by her own body weight, contained everything that mattered now. Not food, though God knew they'd need it. Not extra clothes or money or any of the practical things a woman fleeing into a Dakota winter should carry. No, the saddlebag held papers, ledgers, evidence. 3 years of careful, meticulous record-keeping, all of it damning, all of it written in Leopold Krause's own hand. The neat columns of figures that tracked human misery like a merchant tracks inventory, women bought and sold, government supplies stolen, and resold land, fraudulently claimed lives, destroyed with the casual efficiency of a businessman balancing his books. She'd waited 3 months for the right moment to steal those ledgers. 3 months of playing the role of the grateful, compliant widow, thankful for Herr Krause's generosity in providing her and her son's shelter, while he arranged a suitable match for her. 3 months of cleaning his office, serving his meals, and carefully copying pages from his records whenever she had the chance. 3 months of watching other women arrive at the compound, full of hope, and leave hollow-eyed and silent-bound for destinations they hadn't chosen with men they'd never met. 3 months of planning this escape. She'd waited until Leopold was drunk, not difficult, as he drank most nights imported schnapps that he consumed while playing cards with his men and boasting about his business acumen. She'd waited until Hard Harry and the other guards were occupied with their game, until the compound had settled into its nighttime rhythms. And then she'd moved. The memory of those minutes was already blurring at the edges, becoming dreamlike. The stolen key turning in Leopold's desk lock with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent office. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the ledger, the main one, and the one that contained everything. Wrapping it in oilcloth with trembling fingers. Adding the loose papers she'd already hidden in her room, correspondence with brothel owners, forged deeds, contracts that reduced human beings to commodities. Stuffing it all into the leather saddlebag she'd prepared. Then, the even more terrifying task, waking the boys without alerting anyone else. Edwin had understood immediately, bless him, had helped her gather clothes and what little food she could carry. Oliver had been delirious with fever, barely conscious, as she'd carried him out to the wagon, his small body radiating heat that should have been comforting in the cold night, but instead filled her with terror. Fever like that could kill. Would kill if she couldn't find help. But staying would have killed them all, just more slowly. She'd hitched the horses herself. Thank God Thomas had taught her, that had insisted his wife know how to handle a team, had said you never knew when such knowledge would save your life. At the time, she'd thought him overly cautious. Now she blessed his memory and whispered thanks to a ghost as she'd worked the harness with fumbling hands. And then they'd run. Leopold must have discovered the theft within hours. Mabel had driven the wagon hard through the night, following the North Star with a desperation that bordered on madness, praying for distance, for time, for any kind of head start. But dawn had brought the storm instead of safety, and somewhere behind her, she knew Leopold and his men were coming. They would kill her when they caught her. She had no illusions about that. The ledgers proved too much, revealed too many crimes. Leopold couldn't afford to let her live, couldn't afford to let that evidence reach the authorities. He would kill her and take his records back and probably claim she died in the storm, a tragic accident, such a shame about the poor widow who'd wandered off in confusion. Unless she reached help first. Unless she could find someone, anyone who would listen and act on what those ledgers proved. Unless she survived this damned storm. The wagon lurched sideways with a violence that nearly threw Mabel from the seat. The left wheel had caught on something beneath the snow, a rock, a frozen log, and the remnants of some long-abandoned structure, and for a heart-stopping moment, the whole wagon tilted, balanced on the edge of capsizing. Behind her, Edwin cried out, and Mabel heard the thud of bodies sliding across the wagon bed. She hauled on the reins with strength she didn't know she possessed, screaming at the horses, urging them forward, forward, pull, damn you, pull. The wheel came free with a grinding crack that she felt through the wagon's frame. They lurched forward, the wagon righting itself, and Mabel's heart slowly descended from her throat back into her chest. Behind her, Edwin was crying now, the careful composure he'd maintained finally cracking. She wanted to stop to climb back and hold him to tell him everything would be all right. But she couldn't stop. Stopping meant death. So she drove on into the white. Time lost meaning. There was only the wind and the snow and the endless labor of keeping the horses moving, keeping the wagon upright, keeping herself conscious and fighting against the cold that crept through her clothes and into her bones. Her hands had gone numb an hour ago, or was it 2 hours, 3? She could no longer feel the reins, except as abstract pressure against her palms. Her feet were blocks of ice in her boots. Her face felt frozen and the skin tight and burning. Oliver had stopped shivering. That terrified her more than anything else. She'd heard the stories, knew what it meant when someone stopped shivering in the cold. The body giving up, shutting down, preparing for death. She had to find shelter. Had to find it now soon before the wind shifted, and through the curtain of snow, Mabel glimpsed something that couldn't be real, that had to be a hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion and fear. Orange light, not just one point of light, but several arranged in a rough circle, warm and impossible against the white chaos of the storm. Shapes moved through the snow, dark figures that slowly resolved into structures, not buildings in the white man's style, but something else. Hide lodges, their conical forms barely visible, smoke rising from their peaks to be torn away by the wind. A Lakota winter camp. Mabel's first instinct was a terror so profound it nearly drove rational thought from her mind. Every story she'd heard since stepping off the train in Dakota Territory 3 months ago rushed through her head in a cacophony of violence. Savages who scalped their victims, who stole children, who showed no mercy to white settlers. The compound women had whispered these tales in the evenings, horror stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Leopold himself had warned her about the Indian problem, had described the Lakota as subhuman creatures barely capable of reason, dangerous and unpredictable. But then Oliver made a small sound, a whimper of pain or confusion or both, and Mabel looked back at him. Really looked. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing rapid and shallow, his small body limp in Edwin's arms. And Edwin looked at her with such desperate hope, such absolute trust that his mother would save them, would find a way, would make this right. The boys would die in the storm. Would die within the hour, probably. She would die. They would all freeze to death out here in the white emptiness, and Leopold would find their bodies come spring and burn the ledgers, and that would be the end of it. The end of justice, the end of hope, the end of everything. Whatever awaited her in that camp. Death by bullet or tomahawk captivity slavery. Any of the fates she'd been warned about it couldn't be worse than the certainty of freezing to death. At least there was a chance. A slim one, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. Mabel turned the exhausted horses toward the fires. They were spotted before she'd covered half the distance. Warriors emerged from the lodges with a speed that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying, rifles in hand, and their faces painted in patterns she didn't understand. They moved through the snow with an ease that seemed impossible, as if they were part of the storm rather than victims of it. Within seconds, she was surrounded dark shapes appearing out of the white on all sides. Mabel pulled the wagon to a halt, and the horses were finished anyway, standing with heads down and sides heaving, and slowly, carefully, she raised her hands where the warriors could see them. Empty hands, peaceful, universal language. "Please," she said, her voice hoarse from the cold and the screaming against the wind. "Please, I need help. My son." She gestured toward the wagon bed, toward Oliver's still form. "He's sick, fever. I don't have anywhere else to go. Please." The warriors didn't lower their rifles, but they didn't shoot either. That was something. One of them spoke in Lakota words that sounded harsh and guttural to Mabel's ears, completely incomprehensible. Another responded, and Mabel caught what might have been a question in the tone. Then one of the warriors approached, moving with a grace that seemed impossible given the conditions. He was taller than most men Mabel had known, with broad shoulders and a face that could have been carved from stone, all hard planes and sharp angles. His hair fell long and dark over his shoulders, shot through with what looked like strips of fur or leather. His eyes, when they met Mabel's, were not cruel. Wary, yes. Suspicious, absolutely, but not cruel. Not the eyes of a savage, whatever that was supposed to mean. He lowered his rifle slightly and approached the wagon, his gaze moving from Mabel to the wagon bed. When he saw the boys, Edwin holding Oliver, both of them shivering, both clearly at the edge of endurance, something flickered across his face. Not quite sympathy, but something close to it. Recognition, perhaps. Recognition of desperation, of a need. He spoke in Lakota again, but this time his tone was different. Not a question, but a command. Several women emerged from the lodges wrapped in buffalo robes and wool blankets, their faces weathered and strong. The warrior gestured to the wagon to the boys, and the women moved forward without hesitation. One of them, older, with silver threading through her long braided hair and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came only through surviving what shouldn't be survivable, came directly to the wagon. She reached out and placed a hand on Oliver's forehead, her expression growing more focused. She said something in Lakota rapid words that carried the weight of diagnosis and decision. The warrior who'd first approached, clearly someone important, someone the others deferred to, nodded once sharp and decisive. Then he turned to Mabel and spoke in English, his accent thick, but his words clear enough. "Come," he said. "We help, boy. Come now before storm takes all." Mabel nearly wept with relief. nearly collapsed right there on the wagon seat. But she held herself together. She had to hold herself together, and nodded. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you, I thank you." The warrior nodded again, then turned and began giving orders in Lakota. The camp mobilized with remarkable efficiency. Men unhitched her horses and led them toward what looked like a sheltered area between lodges. Women reached up for the boys' gentle hands, taking them from the wagon with practiced care. Someone took the saddlebag from Mabel's feet, and she nearly lunged after it, the ledgers, but forced herself to stay still. If they wanted to rob her, fine. If they wanted to kill her, fine. But first they were helping her sons, and that was all that mattered. She climbed down from the wagon on legs that barely held her weight, nearly falling face first into the snow. Strong hands caught her, the warrior with the stone face, and steadied her. Up close, he smelled of wood smoke and leather and something else, something she couldn't identify, but that seemed clean and honest. "Walk," he said. "Need to walk or you freeze. Walk." He was right. Standing still meant death. Mabel forced her frozen legs to move one step and then another, following the women who carried her sons into the largest lodge. The warrior stayed close, his hand hovering near her elbow, ready to catch her if she fell. Inside the lodge was warmth. Not just warmth, heat-blessed heat that hit Mabel like a physical blow after the hours in the killing cold. A fire burned in a pit at the center of the lodge, smoke rising toward the opening at the top. Buffalo robes covered the ground and hung from the lodge poles, creating layers of insulation. It was, Mabel realized with a shock, that bordered on betrayal of everything she'd been told comfortable. More than comfortable, it was warm and dry, and carefully organized a home. The women laid Oliver on a bed of furs near the fire and began unwrapping his blankets with gentle efficiency. Edwin stayed close to his brother, his young face etched with worry and exhaustion. One of the younger women brought him a cup of something steaming, pressing it into his hands, with a soft word that transcended language barriers. Edwin grimaced at the taste, but drank again. The older woman, the one who'd first touched Oliver's forehead, was already at work. She had bundles of dried herbs that she was crushing between her palms, adding them to a bowl of what looked like hot water. The scent filled the lodge, sharp and medicinal. She began sponging Oliver's face and chest with the mixture, all the while speaking in a low, steady voice that might have been prayer or instruction or simply comfort. The warrior remained near the entrance watching. After a moment, he spoke. "I am Lakota," he said. "This is my sister's lodge. The healer is Winona, my mother's sister. She is skilled with fever medicine. Your son will be cared for. My name is Mabel." She managed, her voice shaking now that the immediate crisis had passed and reaction was setting in. "Mabel Hirsch. My sons Edwin and Oliver. Thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough." Dakota's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes might have softened fractionally. "You ran far in bad storm," he said. "To run so far in such cold with sick child." He paused. "You must fear something worse than cold, worse than death." It wasn't a question, but Mabel answered anyway. "Yes," she said simply. "I fear what's behind me more than I feared the storm. More than I feared—" She stopped, unsure how to continue. "More than I feared you." That's what she'd almost said. But now, standing in the warmth of this lodge, watching these people care for her sons, with a gentleness she hadn't expected, the words seemed not just tactless, but wrong. Lakota nodded slowly. "Bad men chase you." "Yes." "How many men?" Mabel's hand moved instinctively to where the saddlebag had been, then remembered one of the women had taken it. "6, maybe more. The man who leads them, Leopold Krauss, he has money, and he has men who'll do whatever he pays them to do." "And why does this man chase you?" Dakota's gaze was steady, assessing. Not hostile, but not naive either. He wanted to know what trouble she'd brought to his camp, what danger might follow her here. It was a fair question. Mabel met his eyes. "Because I stole from him," she said. "I stole evidence of his crimes, and he can't afford to let me live with that knowledge. He traffics women, sells them like cattle to settlers and miners. He forges land deeds and steals from government programs. He's stolen from your people too, from Indian relief funds meant to provide supplies to the tribes. It's all documented, all written down in his own hand." She took a breath. "And I took those documents. I took proof of everything he's done, and now he's coming to get them back." Dakota's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "This man steals from the relief programs, the supplies promised by the government." "Yes. For at least 2 years, probably longer." Mabel looked around. "Where did your women put my saddlebag, the leather one from the wagon I can show you?" Dakota spoke in Lakota, and one of the women brought the saddlebag. Mabel opened it with hands that still shook from cold and exhaustion, pulling out the main ledger. Its leather cover was water-stained and worn, but the pages inside were intact, protected by the oilcloth she'd wrapped it in. She opened it to a page she'd memorized, ran her finger down a column of entries. "Here," she said. "October of last year. This entry shows Leopold's certified delivery of 200 pounds of flour, 100 wool blankets, 50 pounds of salt pork, and medical supplies to—" She squinted at the notation. "Crooked Willow Mission." But the actual delivery was maybe a quarter of that. He kept the rest and sold it in Diamond Creek and the other settlements. Dakota took the ledger, his fingers careful on the pages. He couldn't read English that was clear from the way his eyes moved across the text without comprehension. But he understood numbers, understood the concept of columns and entries, and he understood the significance of what he held evidence-proof power. "Crooked Willow," he said slowly. "That is Father Nathaniel's mission. We know him. He complained last winter that the promised supplies did not arrive, that his people went hungry because of broken promises." His expression grew harder. "We thought it was the government breaking promises as they always do. But it was this man, this Leopold Krauss." "Yes," Mabel said. "And he's been doing it everywhere, to every mission and agency he has contracts with. Stealing from everyone and getting rich while people suffer." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Around them, the women continued their work, tending Oliver, offering food and warm drinks to Edwin, preparing a space where Mabel could rest. The domestic sounds were oddly comforting, a reminder that life went on even in crisis, that care and routine and simple kindness were universal languages. Finally, Dakota looked back at Mabel. "When these men come, this Leopold and his men, they will want you back. They will want the ledgers back. They may threaten violence to get both." "I know," Mabel said. "I'll understand if you want me to leave. I don't want to bring trouble to your people. But Oliver, he needs time to recover. Even just a day or two. If I could stay until—" "No," Dakota interrupted. "You stay. You and your sons stay here as long as needed." Mabel blinked, surprised. "But the danger." "This man has stolen from our people," Dakota said. And now there was steel in his voice. "He has taken food from our children, blankets from our elders, medicine that could have saved lives. He has grown fat on our suffering while pretending to be our friend, our helper." He held up the ledger. "This proves it. You brought us proof of what we suspected, but could not prove. For that alone, we owe you protection." "I don't want to start a war," Mabel said quietly. "If the army comes because of me, the army comes whether we want it or not." Dakota replied, his tone matter of fact. "They come, they make treaties, they break treaties. They promise and lie and promise again. We know this. But this, he gestured to the ledger, this is their own law, their own proof. If we have this, maybe we can make their law work for once. Make it mean something. Mabel wanted to tell him that the law didn't work that way, that men like Leopold had friends and connections and money that let them escape justice, that the system was rigged from the start. But she stopped herself. Maybe he was right. Maybe this, once the evidence was strong enough, clear enough, damning enough, that even a corrupt system couldn't ignore it. And if she didn't believe that, then what had she risked everything for? All right, she said. Then we'll face him together. Dakota nodded, once then turned to speak with the other women in Lakota. Mabel sank down onto a pile of furs near the fire, suddenly aware of just how exhausted she was. Every muscle ached. Her hands and feet burned as feeling slowly, painfully returned. But they were alive. They were warm. Oliver was being cared for by someone who clearly knew what she was doing. They had a chance. Edwin came and sat beside her, leaning against her side. "Mama," he said quietly, "are we safe now?" Mabel wrapped an arm around him, pulled him close. "For now," she said. "For now we're safe." It wasn't a lie exactly. Just an incomplete truth. They were safe for this moment in this lodge, surrounded by people who had chosen to help them. But Leopold was coming, and when he arrived, safety would become something much more complicated. Outside the lodge, the wind continued to howl, but inside it was warm. Oliver's breathing had already begun to ease under Winona's ministrations, his fever breaking slightly. Dakota sat near the entrance, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, preparing for whatever came next. Mabel closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest just for a moment. Just long enough to gather strength for the battle ahead. 5 days earlier, the compound at Diamond Creek sat in a shallow valley like a tumor nestled in healthy flesh, a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around the 2-story structure Leopold Krauss had named with characteristic grandiosity, Prosperity Hall. It was neither prosperous nor a hall. Just a building with pretensions above its station, its whitewashed walls already peeling in the harsh Dakota weather, its windows staring like empty eyes across the muddy yard. Mabel had lived there for 3 months, and every day felt like a slow death of the soul. She'd arrived in mid-September with Edwin and Oliver stepping off the train at Diamond Creek Station, with 2 battered trunks and a heart full of desperate hope. The journey from Pittsburgh had been exhausting, 2 weeks of trains and stagecoaches, and finally, a bone-rattling wagon ride from Yankton, traveling through a landscape so vast and empty, it had made Mabel feel like she was falling off the edge of the world. But she'd endured it all, because of the advertisement, the one she'd found folded in her late husband's blacksmithing journal, the one that had seemed like Providence respectable widows wanted for homestead opportunities in Dakota Territory. Land grants available through Homestead Act provisions. Matrimonial arrangements possible for suitable candidates. Clean Christian women of good character may inquire. Transportation assistance provided. Right to L. Krauss, Diamond Creek Station, Dakota Territory. It had seemed like an answer to prayers she'd been too exhausted to articulate. Thomas had died the previous winter, pneumonia, sudden and brutal, taking him from healthy man to corpse in 5 days that Mabel still couldn't quite believe had been real. The blacksmith shop had been sold to cover his debts. The house had gone to his creditors. Mabel's options had narrowed to a handful of grim choices: take work as a seamstress or laundress, earning barely enough to feed herself, much less 2 growing boys. Move in with Thomas's sister Margaret in Philadelphia, a woman whose tight-lipped disapproval had made even holiday visits feel like penance. Or risk everything on a new start, far from the memories and the debts and the closed doors. She'd chosen the West. Chosen opportunity over certainty, hope over safety. God, what a fool she'd been. Leopold Krauss had met her at the station himself, all continental charm and solicitous manners. He was a thick-bodied man in his 50s, with the kind of face that suggested prosperity. Fleshy cheeks, well-fed jowls, small bright eyes that tracked everything with merchant's calculation. His German accent lent an air of sophistication to his promises. "Ah, Mrs. Hirsch, welcome, welcome." He'd taken her hand and kissed it, a gesture that had seemed courtly at the time, but in retrospect felt predatory. "And these fine young men, they will grow strong in Dakota air." Yes, the territory is hungry for young families, for hard-working people who understand the value of land and opportunity. Already, I have several suitable gentlemen interested in meeting you. Good men, landowners, men of substance who need the civilizing influence of a refined woman such as yourself. The compound had seemed rustic but clean. The buildings well maintained, the yard organized. There were 8 other women in residence, ranging in age from a girl named Sarah, who couldn't have been more than 19, to a widow named Mrs. Kowalski, who admitted to 53 years. They'd welcomed Mabel politely, but without warmth, and within 24 hours, she'd understood why. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a transaction. Leopold Krauss didn't arrange marriages. He sold women. The polite fiction of introductions and suitable matches disguised a brutal calculus. Leopold took payment from men seeking wives or laborers, or in cases Mabel tried not to think about too directly, something else entirely. The women who pleased their buyers were shipped off to remote homesteads, mining camps, and rough frontier towns where questions weren't asked. The women who didn't please, or who complained, or who tried to leave, Mabel had never seen any of them again. She'd been careful from the start, some instinct warning her that this situation was more dangerous than Leopold's oily courtesy suggested. Years of managing Thomas's household accounts and helping with the business side of his blacksmith shop had taught her to notice details, to read documents and ledgers, to understand when numbers didn't add up. And Leopold's numbers definitely didn't add up. The compound supposedly operated on fees paid by the settlers' men who paid Leopold to find them suitable brides, and modest contributions from the women themselves, small amounts they were required to send ahead before their journey west to secure their placement. But Mabel had glimpsed Leopold's account books during her cleaning duties, had seen the correspondence that crossed his desk, and the money flowing through Diamond Creek was far more than simple matchmaking fees could explain. So she'd started paying attention, really paying attention with the focus she'd once applied to Thomas's books, tracking every penny to make sure the business stayed solvent. She'd listened at doors when Leopold met with his associates. She'd read documents left carelessly on his desk when she cleaned his office. She'd memorized names and dates and figures. And slowly, methodically, with the patience of a spider spinning a web, she'd pieced together the truth. Leopold Krauss was stealing from everyone. The homestead claims he helped settlers file were often fraudulent forged deeds, invalid surveys, land that legally belonged to the Lakota or other tribes, or sometimes to other settlers whose paperwork had mysteriously gone missing. He took government money meant for Indian relief programs and pocketed most of it, delivering only a fraction of the promised supplies while skimming thousands of dollars off the top. He charged the women in his care excessive processing fees and forced them to work as unpaid domestic labor while they waited for placement. And the trafficking was even worse than Mabel had initially feared. She'd found correspondence with brothel owners in the Black Hills gold camps, with labor contractors in California who were always looking for domestic workers, with men whose letters made her stomach turn with their casual discussion of purchasing women as if they were livestock. It was all written down. Every transaction, every theft, every woman sold. Leopold was meticulous in his record-keeping, confident in his power and isolation. Who would audit him out here 200 miles from anything resembling civilization? Who would question a respected businessman's books? Who would listen if they did question? Mabel would. Mabel would make them listen. She'd begun stealing pages from the ledgers 2 months ago, carefully never more than 1 or 2 pages at a time, hiding them beneath her mattress. She'd copied letters when she had the chance, laboriously transcribing Leopold's correspondence by candlelight after the boys were asleep. And 3 weeks ago, she'd made her decision she would take the boys and run. She would take the evidence and bring it to the territorial authorities, to the army, to a newspaper, to anyone who would listen and act. Leopold Krauss would face justice. But then Oliver had fallen ill, and everything had become more complicated. The fever had started 3 days ago, mild at first, but climbing steadily. Mabel had dosed him with willow bark tea and kept him warm, but she'd seen fevers like this before. If it didn't break soon, if it kept climbing, Oliver could die. He needed a real doctor, real medicine, real care. But Leopold had been watching her more closely lately. She'd felt his eyes on her, felt the weight of his suspicion. He'd stopped leaving certain documents on his desk. He'd started locking drawers that used to remain open. He knew something was wrong, even if he didn't yet know what. Then 2 days ago, Hard Harry had warned her. Harry was Leopold's chief enforcer, a scarred mountain of a man who terrified everyone at the compound. He never spoke unless Leopold ordered him to. He never showed emotion. He simply existed as a walking threat, a reminder of what happened to women who caused problems. Mabel had been terrified of him since the day she'd arrived. So when he'd found her alone in the kitchen, when he'd stepped close enough that she could smell tobacco and leather and something metallic that might have been old blood, she'd thought she was about to die. Instead, he'd spoken 3 words. "He knows tonight." Then he'd walked away, leaving Mabel standing frozen by the sink, with her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She hadn't asked what Leopold knew or how he'd found out. She'd simply nodded to Harry's retreating back and begun planning. If Leopold was going to move against her tonight, she had to move first. Sick child or not, storm coming or not, she had no choice. Running into a Dakota winter with a fevered 6-year-old was a terrible plan. Staying was worse. She'd waited until after midnight, until the compound had settled into uneasy sleep. The men were in the bunkhouse, drunk and loud with their card game. Leopold was in his private quarters, hopefully passed out from his nightly bottle of schnapps. The other women were in the dormitory building, locked in from the outside. Leopold had started doing that a month ago, after Mrs. Kowalski had tried to run. Only Mabel had her own small room, a privilege granted because she had children. Because Leopold thought she was too encumbered to run, too dependent on his generosity to risk flight. He was about to learn how wrong he was. She'd moved through the darkened house with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like cannon fire. Every shadow looked like one of Leopold's men. But she'd made it to his office, made it to his desk, with the stolen key she'd had made from a wax impression 2 weeks ago. The ledgers were in the bottom drawer, locked separately. But Leopold kept that key in the top drawer, hidden under a stack of blank contracts. Mabel had watched him open that drawer 100 times while she cleaned. Her hands shook as she worked the lock, as she lifted out the main ledger, massive and heavy bound in leather that smelled of tobacco and ink. It contained everything. 3 years of transactions, all of Leopold's crimes laid out in his neat, careful handwriting. Every woman trafficked, every acre, fraudulently claimed every dollar stolen from government programs, meant to help the tribe survive the brutal transition from their traditional ways to reservation life. He documented it all with a businessman's precision, confident that no one would ever see these pages except himself. Mabel had wrapped the ledger in oilcloth and stuffed it into the leather saddlebag she'd prepared along with the pages she'd already stolen and a bundle of the most damning correspondence. The bag was heavy, awkward. She'd slung it across her body and crept out of the office, her breath coming in short gasps. Then she'd gone to wake the boys. Edwin had been frightened, but brave, his serious young face grave. as he'd helped her gather clothes and blankets. He'd asked no questions, just moved quickly and quietly, understanding that this was life or death, even if he didn't understand why. She'd blessed him silently for his trust. Oliver had been delirious with fever, barely conscious, as she'd carried him out to the wagon. His skin had been hot enough to burn his small body, trembling his breath, coming too fast and too shallow. But she'd had no choice. No choice but to risk everything to steal Leopold's best wagon team and drive them into the night. The horses had been in the barn, easy enough to hitch for a woman who knew what she was doing. Mabel had worked with steady hands, despite the terror singing through her veins. She'd stolen food from the kitchen, bread, cheese, dried meat, whatever she could grab quickly. She'd taken blankets from the linen closet. She'd taken Leopold's buffalo coat from its hook by the door, the one he was so proud of, and added it to the pile. And then they'd run. North, always north. Away from Leopold, away from the compound, away from everything he represented. The stars had been brilliant in the clear night sky, the North Star pointing the way, like God's own compass. Mabel had driven the team hard, urging them to speed, to distance, to escape. She'd made maybe 15 miles before the storm caught them. The weather had changed with terrifying speed, clear sky giving way to the kind of clouds that promised biblical vengeance. The wind had picked up bitter and fierce, carrying the smell of snow. Within an hour, the world had turned white, and Mabel had been driving blind, trusting the horses to keep moving forward, praying they wouldn't walk them all off a cliff or into a ravine. And now here she was, in a Lakota winter camp, surrounded by the very people Leopold had warned her about with such vehemence. The savage Indians, he'd called them. Dangerous, unpredictable, barely human. Looking around the warm lodge, watching Winona tend Oliver with gentle expertise, while Dakota organized the camp's defense. Mabel felt a surge of anger at Leopold that was almost physically painful. He'd lied about everything, every single thing, and she was going to make sure the world knew it. The storm broke just before dawn, the wind dying to an eerie whisper, and the snow tapering off to scattered flurries that drifted down like ash. Mabel stood outside the lodge, wrapped in a buffalo robe that Dakota's sister had given her, and watched the eastern sky lighten from black to charcoal to pale gray. The world had been transformed overnight, buried under snow that had drifted into sculptural shapes against the lodges and erased all traces of the land beneath. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost hostile, a reminder that nature could be both magnificent and deadly in the same breath. Dakota appeared beside her, moving so quietly. She didn't hear him until he spoke. She should have been startled, would have been a month ago, but somehow his presence felt natural, expected. Safe. Your son's fever broke in the night, he said. Winona's medicine is strong. He will recover. Mabel's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. Thank you. She managed her voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. Thank your aunt. I have no way to repay her, no way to repay any of you, but I swear I'll find a way. You owe us nothing, Dakota interrupted gently. We do not help because we expect payment. We help because it is right, because your son needed help and we could give it. He paused. But I would know more about this man who chases you. You say he steals from Indian relief programs. Tell me exactly what that means. Mabel took a breath, organizing her thoughts. The government has treaties with many tribes. Part of those treaties involves providing supplies, food blankets, medicine tools. The Bureau of Indian Affairs contracts with businessmen like Leopold to deliver these supplies to missions and agencies. Leopold has contracts with several missions in this region. We know this, Dakota said. We have seen these supplies. Not enough, never what is promised, but some things arrive. That's because Leopold keeps most of it, Mabel said bluntly. The government pays him for, say, 500 pounds of flour. Leopold delivers 100 and sells the rest for profit. The tribes get a fraction of what they're legally owed, and Leopold pockets the difference. Dakota's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. How long has this been happening? At least 2 years, probably longer. I only have records going back 2 years, but I suspect he's been doing it since he first got the contracts. Mabel pulled the ledger from beneath her robe, where she'd been keeping it close since Dakota had returned it to her the night before. It's all documented here. Dates, amounts, what was contracted versus what was actually delivered. If you can find someone who reads English, they can verify every word. There is a missionary at Crooked Willow Mission, Dakota said slowly. Father Nathaniel. He is a Jesuit young, but he speaks Lakota and English both. He reads and writes. He has tried to help our people, though we do not always agree with his religion. He paused. He has also complained many times about supplies not arriving, about promises broken. Many in his mission went hungry last winter because what was promised did not come. Because Leopold stole it, Mabel said, and she couldn't keep the anger from her voice. He stole food from hungry people and sold it for profit. He's been getting rich while children go hungry, while elders freeze without enough blankets, while people die from lack of medicine. Then he is our enemy, as well as yours. Dakota looked toward the southern horizon, where the storm clouds were breaking up, revealing patches of pale blue sky. He will come today. When the weather clears enough to travel, he will come. We should be ready. They spent the morning preparing. The Lakota camp mobilized with a quiet efficiency that impressed Mabel. There was no panic, no chaos, just purposeful movement and clear organization. Warriors checked their weapons and took up positions around the camp's perimeter. Women moved the children and elders into the most defensible lodges. Scouts were sent out to watch the southern approach. Dakota explained the situation to Mabel as they worked. We cannot attack white men, even men like Leopold. If we do, the army will use it as excuse to punish not just this camp, but all Lakota. They look for reasons to break treaties to take more land. We will not give them that reason. I understand, Mabel said. So what's the plan? We defend ourselves if attacked. That is legal even by white law, and we protect you and the evidence. If Leopold wants the ledgers, he must come into the camp to take them. And if he does that, he proves his guilt. Dakota smiled grimly. We need to bring this to a judge, Mabel, a white judge with authority over white criminals. The evidence you have, it is powerful, but it means nothing unless the right people see it. The nearest territorial judge is in Yankton, Mabel said. That's more than 100 miles south. We'd have to pass Diamond Creek to get there. Leopold would stop us long before we arrived. Then we make the judge come to us. Dakota gestured to where Father Nathaniel was being escorted into camp by 2 warriors. The young priest looked half frozen, his face red with cold, but his expression was alert and determined. Father Nathaniel knows Judge Blackwell. He says the judge is a fair man, one who cares about law more than profit. If we can convince the priest to ride to Yankton and bring the judge here, we can force Leopold to face justice on neutral ground. It was a dangerous plan with a dozen ways to fail. But Mabel could see the logic in it. Running would only delay the inevitable. Leopold had money connections and the ruthless determination of a man protecting his empire. He could chase her across the territory, across the country if necessary. But if they faced him here with the Lakota as witnesses, with the evidence in hand, with a territorial judge to enforce the law, maybe justice was possible after all. All right, Mabel said. Let's do it. Father Nathaniel was brought to Dakota's sister's lodge, where Mabel and Dakota sat him by the fire and showed him the ledgers. The young priest's hands shook as he turned the pages, his face growing paler with each entry he read. When he reached the section detailing the Crooked Willow supply thefts, he made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. "Dear God," he whispered. "Dear merciful God. I've been telling my congregation to trust the relief program, to believe that the government's intentions are good, even if the execution is imperfect. But this," he looked up at Mabel, his eyes haunted. "This is not imperfect execution. This is systematic theft." "Yes," Mabel said simply. "And it's not just your mission. He's been doing it to every tribe and mission he has contracts with. Skimming off the top, stealing supplies, getting rich while people suffer." Father Nathaniel closed his eyes, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been curses. Finally, he said, "Judge Cornelius Blackwell. He's the territorial judge for this district based in Yankton. He's stern but fair, and he's been trying to clean up corruption in the territorial administration for years." The priest looked at Lakota. "If I can get this evidence to him, he will act on it. I know he will." "Then you must ride to Yankton," Lakota said. "Bring Judge Blackwell here. Tell him there is a matter of territorial importance, of treaty violations, and government fraud. Tell him we have evidence that will prove everything. It's 3 days there and 3 days back if the weather holds," Father Nathaniel said. "Can you keep Mrs. Hirsch and her son safe for that long?" "Yes," Lakota said with absolute certainty. "We will keep them safe." Father Nathaniel nodded slowly, then gathered the most damning pages from the ledger. Lakota insisted they keep the main book in camp, but copies of key pages would help convince the judge to make the journey. The priest stood wrapping himself in his heavy coat and preparing to leave. "Pray for clear roads," he said. "And pray that Leopold doesn't realize where I'm going and try to stop me." He left within the hour, riding one of the camp's fastest horses, carrying documents that could change everything or could simply get him killed on the road to Yankton. Mabel watched him go and felt the weight of hope and dread settling on her shoulders in equal measure. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the terror of the blizzard, Mabel sat with her sons in the lodge. Oliver was recovering rapidly, his fever gone, and his appetite returning with the fierce hunger of childhood. He'd eaten 2 bowls of the venison stew Winona had prepared and was asking for more. Edwin remained quieter, more watchful, processing everything he'd seen with a solemnity that hurt Mabel's heart. "Mama," Edwin said in a voice barely above a whisper, "what happens if the judge doesn't come? What happens if Mr. Kraus comes back first with more men?" Mabel pulled him close, breathing in the little boy's smell of him, sweat and smoke and something indefinably sweet. "Then we fight," she said. "Not with guns maybe, but we fight with the truth, with the evidence, with the allies we've made here." She kissed the top of his head. "Your father didn't raise his sons to give up, and I'm not going to start teaching you that now." Edwin nodded against her shoulder. "I'm not afraid," he said, but his voice shook. "It's all right to be afraid," Mabel told him. "I'm afraid too. Fear is just your body telling you that something matters, that you need to pay attention and be careful. Brave people feel fear. They just don't let it stop them from doing what's right." "Like you," Edwin said. "You were afraid, but you ran anyway." "Like all of us," Mabel corrected. "Lakota and his people, they're afraid of what the army might do, but they're helping us anyway. Father Nathaniel is afraid, but he's riding through dangerous territory to get the judge. Being brave doesn't mean not feeling scared. It means feeling scared and doing the right thing anyway." "I'll remember," Edwin promised. Across the fire, Lakota sat cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and practiced. He looked up and met Mabel's gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or a recognition of shared purpose. They were both protecting what mattered most. They were both willing to fight for it. They were both afraid, and they were both determined not to let that fear win. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the scent of more snow. But inside the lodge it was warm, and for this moment at least they were safe. Tomorrow, Leopold would come. Tomorrow they would face him with evidence and allies, and the desperate hope that justice still meant something in this hard land. But tonight they rested. Day 6, the confrontation. Leopold Krauss arrived just after noon on the 6th day, and he brought an army. Mabel saw them coming from her position near the lodge, a line of riders approaching from the south. Dark shapes against the white landscape. 6 men then, 8, then she stopped counting because there were too many. All of them armed, all of them moving with the grim purpose of men who'd been promised payment for violence. At the head of the group rode Leopold himself, his bulk unmistakable, even at a distance, wrapped in furs that made him look like some grotesque bear. Beside him rode Hard Harry, his scarred face expressionless, his rifle held ready. Behind them came the compound guards and what looked like hired guns from Diamond Creek men, whose only loyalty was to coin and who asked no questions about the morality of their work. And beside Leopold, in an army uniform that looked painfully new and uncomfortable, rode a young captain. They brought the military, Lakota said quietly, appearing at Mabel's side. That complicates things. That's an understatement. Mabel managed her mouth dry with fear. If the army backs Leopold's claim, then we rely on white law to protect us. Lakota finished. The evidence, the ledger's the truth. It must be enough. The Lakota camp was ready. Warriors stood in a loose perimeter around the lodges, their rifles visible, but not raised a statement of capability and restraint. Women and children had been moved to the interior lodges out of immediate danger. Scouts watched from the ridges. Everything that could be done had been done. Now they waited. Leopold reined in his horse perhaps 20 yards from where Lakota and Mabel stood. Up close in the harsh winter sunlight, he looked worse than Mabel remembered. His face was puffy and mottled red from drink and cold. His eyes were bloodshot, his carefully pomaded hair disheveled and greasy. He'd ridden hard for days, and it showed in the tremor of his hands and the wildness around his eyes. "Mrs. Hirsch," Leopold said, and his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "You have caused me considerable trouble, considerable expense, considerable inconvenience." "Good," Mabel replied. She was proud that her voice came out steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You've caused trouble and expense and inconvenience, and worse to enough people. Time someone returned the favor." Leopold's face darkened with fury. "You ungrateful bitch. I gave you shelter food opportunity. I offered to arrange a respectable match for you to secure your son's futures. And this is how you repay my generosity, by stealing from me, by running to these savages." "You gave me a cell and called it shelter," Mabel shot back. "You offered to sell me like livestock and called it opportunity. And these people," she gestured to the Lakota around them, "these people have shown me more genuine kindness and humanity in 5 days than you showed in 3 months of your generosity." Leopold's gaze moved to Lakota, and his expression twisted with contempt. "You, Indian. Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself involved in? This woman is a thief. She has stolen valuable property from me, account books, correspondence items of significant monetary value. I demand you return her and the stolen goods immediately." Lakota's expression didn't change, but Mabel felt the tension radiating from him. She is not property to be returned. He said, his English careful and precise. She is a person who sought refuge from danger. And the items she stole are records of your crimes. We will not return them. Crimes? Leopold laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. You think anyone will believe her word over mine or yours? I am a legitimate businessman with contracts and connections throughout the territory. She is a hysterical widow who ran away in the middle of the night, probably suffering from female hysteria or grief madness. And you are... He paused, seeming to search for the most insulting term. A savage whose people's days on this land are numbered. The army will sweep you all off within the year, and good riddance. The young captain, his name badge read Henderson, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mr. Kraus. I'm not sure this language is. Captain Henderson, you are here to assist in the recovery of stolen property and the apprehension of a criminal. Leopold snapped. I don't need your commentary on my word choice. I need you to do your job. My job, Henderson said with the careful tone of a man picking his way through a minefield, is to maintain order and ensure compliance with territorial law. I'm not convinced that the ledgers speak for themselves. Mabel interrupted, pulling the main ledger from beneath her coat. Every transaction, every forged deed, every woman you trafficked, every dollar you stole from Indian relief programs, it's all here, Leopold. All documented in your own handwriting with your own signature. Something flickered in Leopold's eyes, not quite fear, but something close to it. Recognition of real danger. Give me those ledgers, Mrs. Hirsch. I'll be generous. You and your sons can leave the territory safely. I'll even pay your train fare back east. But if you refuse... He gestured to the men behind him, their weapons clearly visible. Well, accidents happen. Especially in winter, especially when people run foolishly into blizzards and involve themselves with hostile Indians. There will be no accidents, Lakota said quietly, and now there was steel in his voice. And we are not hostile. We have simply offered shelter to a woman in need and protection to evidence of crimes that affect our people as well as hers. Evidence, Leopold sneered. Forged documents more like. Everyone knows Indians can't read English. How would you even know what these papers say? We can read, said a new voice, and Father Nathaniel stepped forward from where he'd been standing near one of the lodges. I've read the ledgers, Mr. Kraus, every page, and I've compared them to my own records from Crooked Willow Mission. The discrepancies are exactly as Mrs. Hirsch described. Leopold's face went pale, then flushed purple with rage. You're supposed to be in Yankton. How did you? I returned this morning, Father Nathaniel said calmly, and I didn't come back alone. From the northern approach, the direction no one had been watching because all attention had been on Leopold's group, came another line of riders. These moved with more order, more discipline. At their head rode a tall, thin man in black with iron-gray hair and the most penetrating eyes Mabel had ever seen. Judge Cornelius Blackwell, territorial judge, wearing his authority like a mantle. Behind him rode 6 territorial marshals, all armed, all looking considerably more professional than Leopold's hired guns. The situation just became exponentially more complicated. Judge Blackwell rode into the center of the clearing and surveyed the scene with the air of a man accustomed to sorting truth from lies. His gaze moved from Leopold to Mabel, to Lakota, to the armed men on all sides, assessing, calculating. Well, he said dryly. Father Nathaniel was not exaggerating when he said this was a matter of territorial importance. Someone want to explain why I just rode 3 days through miserable weather to reach a Lakota winter camp? Your Honor, Leopold said quickly, urging his horse forward. Thank God you're here. This woman, Mrs. Hirsch, has stolen valuable property from my compound and has taken refuge with these Indians. I've been trying to peacefully recover my property. But as you can see, the situation has become quite tense. Your property? Judge Blackwell repeated, his tone unreadable. And what exactly did she steal, Mr. Krause? Business records, account books, personal correspondence. Confidential materials critical to my operations. I see. The judge turned to Mabel. And you are Mabel Hirsch, Your Honor. She stepped forward, holding the ledger. I stole Mr. Krause's account books because they document systematic criminal activity. Fraud, embezzlement, human trafficking, theft of government funds. It's all recorded in his own handwriting. Judge Blackwell's eyebrows rose fractionally. Those are serious accusations, Mrs. Hirsch. They're true accusations, Your Honor. I can prove every word. Your Honor, the woman is clearly unbalanced. Leopold interjected desperately. Female hysteria brought on by grief and the rigors of frontier life. These so-called ledgers are either forgeries or gross misinterpretations of legitimate business transactions. You demand nothing, Mr. Krause, Judge Blackwell said coldly. I'll determine what's legitimate and what isn't. He turned to Dakota. And you are? Dakota of the Lakota. This is our winter camp. Mrs. Hirsch sought shelter here during the blizzard. We have given her protection because we believe her claims are true, and because the crimes she describes have harmed our people as well. Harm to your people, Judge Blackwell repeated thoughtfully. Father Nathaniel mentioned treaty violations and theft from Indian relief programs. You believe Mrs. Hirsch's documents prove such crimes? I do not read English, Dakota said. But Father Nathaniel has translated portions for us. The records show supplies promised to missions and agencies, but never delivered. Supplies that were paid for by the government, but stolen by Leopold Krause for resale. These are lies, Leopold shouted. Slander, Your Honor. I demand that you order the marshals to arrest this woman and retrieve my property immediately. Judge Blackwell ignored him, instead addressing Father Nathaniel. You've examined these documents. I have, Your Honor, extensively, and I've compared them to the records at Crooked Willow Mission and 2 other missions I was able to contact via telegraph from Yankton. Father Nathaniel's voice was steady, but his face was pale. The pattern is consistent and damning. Government pays for supplies that are never fully delivered. Mr. Krause pockets the difference. May I see these documents? Judge Blackwell asked. Mabel handed him the ledger, her hands shaking only slightly. The judge dismounted and moved to a relatively clear patch of ground, spreading the ledger open and beginning to read. The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of wind and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof. Minutes passed. The judge turned pages, his expression growing darker. Finally, he looked up. Mr. Krause, is this your ledger? Your Honor, I've never seen that book before in my life. Mrs. Hirsch clearly forged. Is this your signature? Judge Blackwell pointed to a page. Leopold hesitated fatally. It appears to be, but I can explain. And this entry from October of last year. It shows that you certified delivery of 200 pounds of flour, 100 wool blankets, 50 pounds of salt pork, and various medical supplies to Crooked Willow Mission. Did you make that delivery? Of course I. Father Nathaniel's records show receipt of 30 pounds of flour, 12 blankets, no salt pork, and no medical supplies. Your own ledger. The judge flipped pages. Shows that the excess supplies were sold to merchants in Diamond Creek for substantial profit. He looked up, his eyes like chips of ice. Would you care to explain that discrepancy? Mr. Kraus, Leopold's face cycled through several colors. There must have been mistakes in the delivery, errors in the paperwork, miscommunication between 37 separate discrepancies over 18 months. Judge Blackwell's voice could have frozen water. All errors in your favor, all resulting in profit to you and loss to the people who were legally entitled to those supplies. Your Honor, you don't understand the difficulties of frontier commerce, the challenges of... I understand theft when I see it documented in black and white, Mr. Kraus. Judge Blackwell stood closing the ledger. This is systematic embezzlement of government funds intended to fulfill treaty obligations. That alone is sufficient for federal indictment. I have friends, Leopold said desperately. Friends in the territorial government, friends who will what obstruct a federal investigation. I hope they try. Judge Blackwell turned to Captain Henderson. Captain, I'm formally requesting that you place Mr. Leopold Kraus under arrest, pending indictment for fraud, embezzlement, and violations of the Homestead Act. Additional charges may be filed after I've had time to review these documents fully. Captain Henderson looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Your Honor, with respect, I'd need to consult with my commanding officer before. You need to follow a direct order from a territorial judge with federal jurisdiction, Captain. Or would you prefer I add obstruction of justice charges to what is already going to be a spectacularly embarrassing scandal for everyone involved? Henderson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Mr. Kraus, I'm going to have to ask you to dismount, sir. For a moment, Mabel thought Leopold might actually fight. His hand moved toward his coat, toward a weapon she was certain, and the tension in the clearing ratcheted up to nearly unbearable levels. The marshals' hands moved to their guns. The Lakota warriors raised their rifles slightly. Hard Harry's scarred face remained expressionless, but his rifle was pointed directly at Leopold. Don't, Harry said quietly. Don't make this worse than it already is. Leopold turned on him, desperate and furious. You work for me, Harry. You do what I tell you. I worked for money. Harry interrupted, his voice flat and emotionless. And you're broke, Leopold. That ledger proves it. You've been spending everything to maintain appearances, gambling to try to cover the holes in your accounts, borrowing from people who don't accept excuses for late payment. There's nothing left. It's over. Harry, please, Leopold said. And now there was naked fear in his voice. We can fix this. We just need time to... Time's up, Harry said. He turned to Captain Henderson. You'll want to check the compound at Diamond Creek, Captain. There are 8 women there being held against their will, forced to work while Leopold finds buyers for them. And you'll want to check the southern property, the old Henderson place. There's 2 more women there, working off debts Leopold claims they owe him. Debts that grow larger every week. Debts they can never pay off. You bastard, Leopold hissed. You traitorous bastard, after everything I've done for you. You killed my humanity a long time ago, Leopold, Harry said. And for the first time, emotion flickered across his scarred face. Something bleak and broken. But even I have limits. Human trafficking, stealing from hungry people, forging land deeds. I've done bad things in my life. But this is evil. And I won't protect evil anymore. The marshals moved forward, taking Leopold by the arms. He didn't resist this time. The fight had gone out of him, his carefully constructed empire crumbling in the space of a single afternoon. He sagged between the marshals, suddenly looking old and small and pathetic. Judge Blackwell watched the arrest with grim satisfaction, then turned to Mabel. Mrs. Hirsch, you've performed a considerable service to the territory today. I understand this ordeal has cost you dearly. I did what needed to be done. Mabel said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still singing through her veins. Women were being hurt. Money was being stolen. Someone had to stop it. Indeed. The judge's expression softened fractionally. I'll need you to testify when this comes to trial. Until then, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Before Mabel could answer, Lakota said, she and her sons are welcome to remain here as long as necessary. They are under our protection. Judge Blackwell looked between them, and something in his expression suggested he understood more than what was spoken. Very well. I'll send word when we have a trial date. Given the evidence, I don't expect it will take long. He paused. There will also be the matter of Mr. Krause's assets, his property, his accounts. Much of it will need to be seized to pay restitution to his victims. The women he trafficked should be compensated first, Mabel said firmly. They deserve that much at minimum. Agreed. I'll see to it. Judge Blackwell prepared to leave, then stopped. Mrs. Hirsch, one more thing. Were you aware that Mr. Krause had filed a homestead claim in your name? Mabel stared at him. What? No, I had no idea. According to his records, you were designated as claimant for 160 acres near the Crow Creek confluence. Prime land, from what I understand. The claim appears to be legitimate, one of the few legitimate things Leopold did probably to maintain a veneer of respectability and provide cover for his other fraudulent claims. The judge's eyes held something that might have been approval. If you want it, the land is yours by right under the Homestead Act. Land. Her own land. The thing she'd come west searching for, the security and opportunity she'd wanted for her sons. After everything that had happened, it seemed impossible, like a fairy tale reward that didn't exist in the real world. Mabel's voice caught. Yes. Yes, I want it. For my boys. For our future. Then I'll have the deed properly transferred to your name and recorded. The land is yours, Mrs. Hirsch. You've earned it. Judge Blackwell tipped his hat to her, nodded respectfully to Lakota, and turned to mount his horse. Gentlemen, let's move out. We have a long ride back to Yankton and a great deal of work to do. The marshals fell into formation around Leopold, who sat slumped in his saddle like a man already defeated. Captain Henderson organized his troops with visible relief that the situation had resolved without violence. Within minutes, the clearing was emptying, the various groups departing the way they'd come. Hard Harry remained behind his horse, standing apart from the others. He looked at Mabel for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Why? Mabel asked quietly. Why did you warn me? Why did you turn on him? Harry was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, I had a son once, about your Oliver's age. Fever took him while I was off working for men like Leopold, doing things I'm not proud of. When I got back, he was already buried. I wasn't there. I was making money for evil men instead of being with my boy when he needed me. His voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes held oceans of pain. I looked at your boys, saw you risking everything to save them, and I thought, maybe I could do one decent thing. Maybe I could help one mother save her sons, since I couldn't save my own. Mabel's throat tightened. What will happen to you? Prison, probably. I've done enough to earn it. Harry shrugged. But at least I'll go knowing I stopped being his man. That counts for something. It counts for a lot, Mabel said. Thank you, Harry. He nodded once, then turned his horse and rode after the others, his back straight, carrying whatever remained of his broken honor, like a burden he'd bear to the end. The camp slowly relaxed as the last of the outsiders departed. Warriors lowered their weapons. Women emerged from the lodges with children. Life began to return to its normal rhythms. The crisis passed. Lakota stood beside Mabel, watching the riders disappear into the distance. "It is done," he said quietly. "Yes," Mabel agreed. "It's done." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. Leopold would face trial, yes. The women would be freed, the evidence would be presented, justice would presumably be served. But the real work, the work of building a new life, of making something positive from the wreckage, that work was just beginning. She had land now, 160 acres near Crow Creek, a place to build a home, to raise her sons, to create the future she'd risked everything to secure. And she had allies, friends even, people who'd chosen to help her when they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Lakota turned to her, his dark eyes holding a question he didn't quite voice. Mabel met his gaze and found herself thinking about spring, about building, about possibilities that hadn't existed a week ago. "The land near Crow Creek," Lakota said carefully. "It is good land, water trees for building game. It is also—" He hesitated. "It is near where my people camp in summer. We would be neighbors." "I would like that," Mabel said, and she meant it. "I would like that very much." Something in Lakota's expression eased a tension she hadn't fully noticed releasing. "Then when spring comes and the building can begin, my people will help. We know the land, the best places for structures, how to read the water and the seasons. I would be grateful for any help you could offer," Mabel said. Then more quietly, "I would be grateful for your friendship, Lakota, for your continued presence in our lives." He reached out and took her hand, the gesture simple but weighted with meaning. "You have both," he said. "Always." They stood together in the winter sunlight, and Mabel felt something shift inside her, the tight knot of fear and desperation that had lived in her chest since Thomas's death, slowly beginning to unwind. She wasn't safe yet, not completely. The trial still loomed. The work of building a homestead from raw land would be brutal. The frontier was unforgiving, and a widow with 2 young sons would face challenges she couldn't even imagine yet. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. And that made all the difference. The trial of Leopold Krauss began on a bitter morning in mid-February, 6 weeks after his arrest. Mabel made the journey to Yankton with Lakota as her escort, leaving Edwin and Oliver in the care of Winona, who'd become extraordinarily fond of the boys. The territorial courthouse was packed to overflowing. News of the case had spread like wildfire through the region, and everyone wanted to see the respectable businessman brought down. Leopold had hired lawyers, expensive ones brought in from Chicago, men in fine suits who carried themselves with the arrogance of those accustomed to winning. They'd filed motion after motion, trying to get the case dismissed, trying to suppress the ledgers as evidence, trying to discredit Mabel as a witness. Judge Blackwell had denied every motion with increasingly terse rulings that made his opinion of the defense's tactics abundantly clear. The trial was held in the main courtroom, a high-ceilinged room with tall windows that let in the gray winter light. Leopold sat at the defense table looking diminished, somehow his bulk seeming less imposing and more pathetic now that he was dressed in prison clothes instead of his usual fine woolens. His lawyers flanked him, whispering strategies and objections. But Leopold himself stared straight ahead with the blank expression of a man who'd already accepted defeat. The prosecution was led by Territorial Attorney General Marcus Webb, a lean man in his 40s, with the focused intensity of a hunting hawk. He'd spent weeks preparing the case, interviewing witnesses, cross-referencing the ledgers against government records. This wasn't just a criminal trial. It was a referendum on corruption in the territorial administration, and Webb treated it with the gravity it deserved. Mabel sat in the witness section, her hands folded in her lap, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. Lakota sat behind her in the public gallery, his presence a steadying force. Father Nathaniel was there too, along with several of the women from Leopold's compound, all of them ready to testify. Judge Blackwell called the court to order with 3 strikes of his gavel, and the trial began. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its precision. Webb outlined the charges methodically: 47 counts of fraud related to Indian Relief Program thefts, 23 counts of conspiracy to traffic women, 16 counts of filing fraudulent homestead claims, 12 counts of embezzlement, and numerous lesser charges. He promised to prove each count beyond reasonable doubt using Leopold's own records and the testimony of his victims. The defense's opening was equally aggressive, but from a different angle. Leopold's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Cornelius Hartford, who'd earned a reputation for getting guilty. Men acquitted stood before the jury with the manner of a disappointed schoolteacher addressing wayward students. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "the prosecution would have you believe that my client is some sort of criminal mastermind, a villain from a penny dreadful novel, who spends his days plotting evil and documenting his crimes in elaborate ledgers. The truth is far more mundane and far more tragic. Leopold Krauss is a businessman operating in the most difficult frontier conditions imaginable, trying to fulfill complex government contracts with inadequate resources and infrastructure. Yes, there have been mistakes. Yes, some deliveries fell short of what was promised. But these are the inevitable errors of frontier commerce, not evidence of criminal intent." Hartford paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. "And as for Mrs. Hirsch," his tone shifted, became tinged with sympathy that felt calculated. "She is a widow, grieving and displaced, suffering from the very real effects of trauma and loss. Female hysteria is well documented in medical literature, gentlemen. Women under severe stress can develop delusions, can misinterpret innocent business records as evidence of crimes that don't exist. Mrs. Hirsch needs our sympathy and medical care, not our encouragement of her fantasies." Mabel felt her face heat with anger, but forced herself to remain still. She'd been warned this would happen, that the defense would try to paint her as crazy or hysterical or unreliable. She couldn't give them ammunition by losing her composure. The first week of testimony focused on the Indian Relief Program thefts. Webb called a parade of witnesses, mission administrators, who detailed what was promised versus what was delivered. Government clerks, who'd processed Leopold's contracts, and payment vouchers merchants in Diamond Creek, who'd purchased surplus supplies from Leopold at prices that proved they knew the goods were stolen. The testimony was dry technical, filled with numbers and dates and contractual language. But it was damning. Father Nathaniel testified for an entire afternoon, walking the jury through his mission's records and comparing them to Leopold's ledgers. He spoke with quiet passion about the people who'd gone hungry, the children who died from preventable diseases because promised medicine never arrived, and the elders who'd frozen in winters that should have been survivable with the blankets and supplies they were legally owed. I believed the government was failing in its treaty obligations. Father Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. I told my congregation to be patient, to trust that white men's promises meant something even if fulfillment was delayed. I didn't realize that the promises were being kept, the money was being paid, the supplies were being purchased. But a thief was intercepting them before they could reach the people who needed them. I told starving people to trust, and all the while Mr. Krauss was stealing their food for profit. I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. The defense cross-examined aggressively, trying to suggest that Father Nathaniel's records were incomplete, that his memory was faulty, that he was motivated by anger to exaggerate the shortfalls. But the young priest held firm, his testimony unshakable, because it was backed by documentary evidence that matched Leopold's own ledgers. By the end of the first week, the jury looked grim. The second week focused on the human trafficking charges, and this was where the trial became truly ugly. Webb called the women one by one, and they told their stories. Some spoke clearly, their voices steady with suppressed rage. Others broke down on the witness stand, sobbing as they recounted what had been done to them. A few could barely speak at all, their trauma too fresh, too raw. Sarah, the 19-year-old, testified that she'd been told she would be matched with a young farmer looking for a wife. Instead, she'd been sold to a brothel owner in Deadwood for $300. She'd escaped after 6 months, walking for 3 weeks to reach safety, and she still had nightmares every night. Mrs. Kowalski testified that she'd been matched with a rancher who'd paid Leopold $1,000. She was 53 years old, and the rancher had wanted unpaid domestic labor, not a wife. When she'd objected to the conditions, he'd beaten her. She bore scars still. Giulia Rossi, an Italian widow who'd come to the territory hoping to teach school, testified that Leopold had forged her signature on a contract binding her to a mining camp in Montana, where she would have been the only woman among 200 men. She'd refused to go, and Leopold had locked her in a windowless storage room for 4 days without food to teach her compliance. The testimony went on and on, each story more heartbreaking than the last. Mabel watched the jury's faces and saw shock giving way to anger, discomfort giving way to disgust. These were frontier men used to hardship and violence. But there were lines even they wouldn't cross. What Leopold had done, trafficking women, profiting from their desperation, it crossed every line. The defense tried to fight back. Hartford cross-examined each woman aggressively, questioning their memories, their motivations, suggesting they'd misunderstood the terms of their agreements, or were exaggerating to get attention. He was particularly harsh with Sarah, implying that she'd gone to the brothel willingly and only changed her story when things didn't work out as she'd hoped. It backfired spectacularly. The jury looked outraged at Hartford's tactics, and Judge Blackwell warned the defense attorney twice about badgering witnesses. Then Mabel took the stand. She'd been dreading this moment since the trial began. Hartford would come at her hard. She was the one who'd stolen the ledgers, the one who'd run, the one whose testimony tied all the other evidence together. If he could break her credibility, he could create reasonable doubt. Webb led her through her testimony with patient thoroughness. Mabel described coming to Dakota Territory, arriving at Leopold's compound, slowly realizing what he really was. She described discovering the ledgers, copying pages, planning her escape. She described the night she'd fled the blizzard, finding refuge with the Lakota. "Why did you steal the ledgers, Mrs. Hirsch?" Webb asked. "You could have simply left. Why risk everything to take those documents?" "Because I knew no one would believe me otherwise," Mabel said quietly. "I'm a widow, a nobody. Leopold Krauss is a respected businessman with connections. Without proof, solid, undeniable proof, my accusations would be dismissed as spite or hysteria or lies. The ledgers were proof. They showed in his own handwriting exactly what he'd been doing. I took them because they were the only way to make sure justice happened. And did you forge any of these documents, alter them in any way?" "No. Everything in those ledgers is exactly as Leopold recorded it. I didn't need to change anything. The truth was damning enough." Webb nodded, satisfied, and turned her over to the defense. Hartford approached with the manner of a snake sizing up prey. "Mrs. Hirsch, you testified that you're a widow, that your husband died approximately 2 years ago. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And his death was sudden, unexpected?" "Yes. Pneumonia took him in 5 days." "That must have been very traumatic for you." Mabel saw where this was going but couldn't stop it. "Of course it was traumatic. I loved my husband. Of course, of course." Hartford's tone dripped false sympathy. "And after his death, you experienced financial difficulties." "My husband had debts. When he died, I was left with very little." Desperate circumstances, one might say. The kind of circumstances that might make a person unreliable in their perceptions, perhaps prone to seeing opportunities where none existed or threats where none were intended. Objection, Webb said sharply. Is counsel questioning the witness or giving a medical diagnosis he's unqualified to make? Sustained, Judge Blackwell said. Mr. Hartford, ask questions or sit down. Hartford smiled thinly. Mrs. Hirsch, isn't it true that you arrived in Dakota Territory with 2 young sons desperately seeking financial security, willing to agree to almost any arrangement that would provide for your children? I came seeking honest opportunity, Mabel said, not to be sold like livestock. But you were willing to enter into a marriage arrangement facilitated by my client, were you not? You signed documents agreeing to meet potential suitors. I signed documents agreeing to be introduced to suitable men, with the possibility of eventual marriage if we were compatible. I didn't sign anything agreeing to be auctioned off to whoever paid Leopold the highest fee. Can you prove my client auctioned you? The correspondence in the ledgers proves it. Letters from men offering payment for introduction to specific women, including me. Letters discussing prices, terms, conditions of sale, that's what they were. Mr. Hartford, sales, not introductions. Sales. Hartford changed tactics. Mrs. Hirsch, you testified that you stole these ledgers in the middle of the night while my client was asleep. Isn't it true that you broke into his private office, used a forged key, and stole property that didn't belong to you? I took evidence of crimes being committed, Mabel said. Evidence that was being used to continue committing those crimes. But you stole it. You committed theft. You broke into a locked office and took documents without permission. That's criminal behavior, Mrs. Hirsch. If taking evidence of human trafficking and embezzlement is criminal, then yes, I'm guilty. Mabel said, meeting his gaze directly. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to. Some laws matter more than others, and saving lives matters more than respecting Leopold Krause's property rights. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Judge Blackwell gavelled for order, but Mabel could see approval in his eyes. Hartford pressed on, trying to find an opening. And then you ran to a Lakota camp. Isn't it true that you sought shelter with hostile Indians, potentially endangering your children? I sought shelter with human beings who showed me more kindness than Leopold Krause ever did. Mabel replied, her voice sharp. Dakota and his people saved my son's life. They protected us when we had nowhere else to go. They're not hostile, they're good people who treated us with dignity and respect. More than I can say for your client. Hartford tried several more angles, questioning Mabel's mental state, suggesting she'd misinterpreted innocent business records, implying she was motivated by desire for revenge or attention. But Mabel held firm, her testimony consistent and clear. She had the advantage of truth, and Hartford couldn't break something that was fundamentally solid. Finally, after nearly 4 hours of cross-examination, Hartford gave up and returned to his seat. Mabel stepped down from the witness stand on shaking legs, exhausted but unbroken. The defense called their own witnesses character witnesses who testified to Leopold's business acumen, and charitable works experts who suggested that frontier commerce naturally involved discrepancies and irregularities, a doctor who discussed female hysteria and the unreliability of women under emotional stress. But they couldn't explain the ledgers. They couldn't explain the letters from brothel owners. They couldn't explain the testimony of more than a dozen women who all told the same story. They couldn't explain the government records that proved supplies were paid for but never delivered. The evidence was too strong, too consistent, too damning. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Webb's closing argument was a methodical destruction of the defense's case, walking the jury through each charge and showing how the evidence proved guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Hartford's closing was desperate, filled with appeals to sympathy for a businessman trying to operate in difficult circumstances, to skepticism of women's testimony, to reasonable doubt that wasn't actually reasonable. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict in a voice that carried clearly through the packed courtroom. "We find the defendant, Leopold Krauss, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. People cheered, wept, shouted. Judge Blackwell gavelled for order, his expression satisfied. Leopold sat motionless at the defense table, his face gray, his eyes empty. Whatever had animated him, greed, ambition, the thrill of power, it was gone, now burned out by the weight of justice. Judge Blackwell sentenced him 2 days later. 20 years of hard labor for the trafficking and fraud charges to be served at the United States military prison at Fort Leavenworth. Complete liquidation of his estate with proceeds to be distributed as restitution to his victims. The women would be compensated first, then the tribes and missions he'd stolen from. The compound at Diamond Creek would be dismantled and sold. As the marshals led Leopold away in chains, he looked at Mabel one last time. She met his gaze without flinching, without triumph, without anger. Just tired acceptance that justice sometimes actually happened. Outside the courthouse, the women gathered, all of Leopold's victims, united now by shared experience and survival. They cried and hugged and made plans. Some would return east. Some would stay in the territory, taking their restitution and building new lives. Julia announced her intention to open a school in Diamond Creek, using her compensation to purchase land and materials. Sarah said she would join her, help teach, create something positive from the wreckage. Mabel stood with them, part of this unlikely sisterhood forged in trauma and triumph. They'd survived, they'd fought, they'd won, and now they would build. Epilogue: Spring at Iron Creek. 3 years later, in the early summer of 1875, Mabel Hirsch stood on the bridge that crossed Iron Creek, named for the iron ledger that had brought Leopold Krauss to justice, and watched her sons play in the water below. Edwin was 13 now, tall and brown from the sun, moving with the easy confidence of a boy who knew his place in the world. Oliver was 10, quieter than his brother, but with a quick smile that could light up a room and a gift for languages that let him speak Lakota as fluently as English. The bridge had been Dakota's idea, built the previous autumn as a joint project between the Lakota summer camp and Mabel's homestead. It spanned the creek's narrowest point, solid timber construction that could bear the weight of horses and wagons, connecting the two sides of their community. Mabel loved it for its practicality and for its symbolism, a literal bridge between worlds, between peoples, between the old ways and the new. The territory was changing rapidly, and not always for the better. More settlers arrived every month, bringing pressure and conflict. Treaties were being broken as quickly as they were made. The Lakota and other tribes pushed into smaller and smaller territories. The army presence had increased, and there were rumors of worse to come. The easy coexistence of the early days was giving way to something harder, more complicated, more dangerous. But here at Iron Creek, Mabel and Dakota had carved out something different. A place where two worlds could touch without one destroying the other. A place where Lakota children played with settler children, where Mabel's cabin stood a quarter mile from Dakota's lodge, where cooperation replaced competition and respect replaced fear. It wouldn't last forever. Mabel knew that. The weight of history was against them, the tide of manifest destiny too strong to hold back indefinitely. But for now, today, it was enough. The homestead had grown substantially in 3 years. The original cabin had been expanded twice. Mabel now had a real kitchen, a separate bedroom for the boys, even a small room she used as an office, where she kept accounts for several neighboring homesteaders who'd learned of her skill with numbers. The garden was established and productive, providing vegetables that Mabel preserved for winter and traded with both settler and Lakota families. She had chickens, 2 milk cows, a pen of pigs, and a small herd of cattle that grazed the better portions of her land. It was a working farm now, no longer just raw land and hope. Lakota emerged from the trees, carrying fresh fish for dinner, and wearing the slight smile that Mabel had learned, meant he was pleased. He joined her on the bridge, his shoulder brushing hers in greeting. "They grow fast," he said, nodding toward the boys. "Too fast," Mabel agreed. "Edwin will be thinking about courting girls soon, and I'm not ready for that. The crow girl, Running Deer's daughter, she watches him when she thinks no one sees. Dear God, don't tell me that. I'm definitely not ready for that." But Mabel was smiling as she said it. Her sons were growing up healthy and strong, integrated into both settler and Lakota communities, fluent in multiple languages and comfortable in multiple worlds. They would have advantages she couldn't have imagined 3 years ago. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the water flow beneath them. Finally, Lakota said, "There is news from the south. Not good news." Mabel's smile faded. "Tell me." "More settlers coming. The government is surveying land for a railroad. They say it will bring prosperity opportunity. But it comes through treaty lands. Our lands." His voice was carefully neutral, but Mabel heard the pain beneath. "There will be trouble. Soon." "How soon?" "A year? Maybe 2. Not longer." Mabel's chest tightened. She'd known this was coming, everyone had known. But having a timeline made it real and immediate and frightening. "What will you do?" "My people are divided. Some want to fight. Some want to negotiate, try to get better terms. Some want to move further west, deeper into land the whites haven't taken yet." He paused. "I don't know which is right. Maybe there is no right answer, only less wrong ones." Mabel took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally after years of partnership. They'd never married, not in white terms, or Lakota ones, but they'd built a life together nonetheless. A life that existed in the spaces between cultures, between traditions, between the old world, and whatever was coming next. "Whatever you decide," Mabel said, "we'll face it together. You, me, the boys. We're a family now, even if it doesn't look like what anyone expected." Lakota squeezed her hand. "Yes, family." Below them, Edwin called up asking if they'd caught crawfish for dinner. Oliver was already wading into deeper water, fearless and laughing. The sound carried on the summer air, clear and bright and full of the kind of joy that came only from children who felt safe and loved. The railroad would come. The treaties would be broken. The world would change in ways none of them could control. But here now, in this moment, they had something precious, community connection, hope. The restitution from Leopold's seized assets had been distributed as Judge Blackwell promised. The women had received compensation, not enough to undo the damage, never enough for that, but sufficient to help them rebuild. Julia's school in Diamond Creek was thriving, teaching both settler and Lakota children. Several of the other women had used their funds to start businesses, buy land, create futures. Sarah had married a young farmer and had a baby daughter she'd named Mabel, a gesture that had made Mabel weep. The tribes and missions had received their portion too. The stolen supplies couldn't be returned, but the money helped. New agreements had been negotiated for future relief programs with better oversight and accountability. Father Nathaniel had been instrumental in that, his testimony and advocacy leading to reforms that would help prevent future theft. It wasn't perfect. The system was still corrupt, still broken in fundamental ways. But it was better. Marginally, incrementally better. Hard Harry had served 3 years of his 5-year sentence before being released on parole for good behavior. Mabel had heard he'd moved to Montana, was working as a ranch hand, trying to live a quieter life. She hoped he found some measure of peace, some measure of redemption for the broken man who'd saved her and her sons by finally choosing good over profit. Leopold himself was still in Leavenworth, his health declining, his empire reduced to memories and court transcripts. Mabel tried not to think about him, tried not to let him occupy any space in her thoughts. He'd stolen enough from enough people. She wouldn't let him steal her peace too. Lakota released her hand and headed down to join the boys, his easy movement through the terrain, a reminder of his deep connection to this land. Mabel watched him go and felt a swell of gratitude so profound it hurt. She'd come to Dakota territory desperate and alone, been betrayed and trafficked and nearly destroyed. But she'd survived. More than survived, she'd built something real and valuable from the wreckage. She had land. She had home. She had sons who were thriving. She had a partner who respected her strength and shared her burdens. She had a community that accepted her, despite all the ways she was different, all the ways her life didn't fit neat categories. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered Leopold's advertisement 3 years ago. It was harder in some ways, more complicated, more uncertain. The future held challenges she couldn't predict and threats she couldn't control. But it was real. It was hers, and it was enough. Edwin's laugh rang out bright and clear, followed by Oliver's higher giggle. Lakota was showing them something in the creek fish, probably, or some interesting stone. The scene was so ordinary, so domestic, so perfectly mundane, that it made Mabel's eyes sting with tears. This is what she'd fought for. Not revenge on Leopold or abstract justice or even the land itself. This, her boys' safe and happy building memories that wouldn't be tainted by fear or trauma. The chance to give them a childhood worth remembering, a foundation strong enough to build lives on. The iron ledger that had brought Leopold down sat now in a trunk in Mabel's cabin, a reminder of where they'd been and how far they'd come. But the real legacy wasn't in those pages of evidence and accusation. The real legacy was here in this bridge, spanning the creek, in these children who moved easily between worlds, in this fragile and precious attempt to build something better than what had come before. It wouldn't solve all the territory's problems. It wouldn't stop the railroad or prevent the coming conflicts or heal all the wounds of conquest and colonization. But it was something. A small light against the darkness. Proof that cooperation was possible, that respect could bridge differences, that family could be defined by choice as much as blood. Mabel took one last look at the summer afternoon, the boys playing in the creek, Lakota patient and present the cabin solid on the hill, the garden green, and thriving the bridge connecting it all, and committed it to memory. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The future was uncertain. But today, they had this. And that was worth everything she'd risked, everything she'd endured, everything she'd fought to protect. Lakota called up to her, asking if she was coming to help catch dinner. Mabel smiled and started down from the bridge, moving toward the water, toward her family, toward the life she'd built from courage and ledgers, and the unshakable belief that truth mattered. The iron ledger had been just the beginning. The real work had been everything that came after the building, the healing, the slow daily labor of creating something worth protecting. That work would continue for years, for lifetimes perhaps. It was never finished. But it was good work, honest work, work that mattered. And Mabel Hirsch, widow homesteader survivor, would keep doing it for as long as she had breath. Behind her, the bridge stood solid and strong, spanning the creek, connecting two shores, holding fast against the current. Together,